What's up, everyone? I hope you're all having a blessed day. Today we've got a video on anime abilities we're reacting to. Some people like the overpowered abilities, your broken ones, what just completely change the battlefield. Other people like the strategic, more technical abilities. But today we'll be discussing the flawed anime abilities, those where power actually comes with a price. Let's get straight into the video.
Alright, let me ask you a quick question. At what point in a story are the protagonist's abilities at their most interesting? If you take a moment to really think about it, the vast majority of you will probably come to the same conclusion that it's at the tail end of the series. And I completely understand that viewpoint. By the end of the story, the protagonist has likely reached the pinnacle of their strength,
Full
perfecting
power
every skill
release.
they've picked up since the beginning, and often unlocking some kind of god-tier endgame power that ends up defining their character in all future power scaling debates. And for the most part, I completely agree with this perspective. There's definitely something trying
Stronger.
about seeing a protagonist who's grown to
Narrative.
fully master their abilities. But even I've always had a soft spot for a different period in their growth. Around, say, the 30% mark of the story, when they've unlocked their long-term abilities, but they're still rough around the edges, unpolished, learning. Because to a large degree, I believe there is a kind of beauty in imperfect abilities, one that allows
Good
writers
point.
to create more engaging scenarios and battles than perfect abilities allow. So what is it that makes these flawed, incomplete powers so interesting? How do great writers portray the early stages of a character's growth in a way that's compelling? And what are some standout examples of this being done? That's what we'll be exploring in today's video. So stick around, you might just learn something important. So why do I enjoy the protagonist's imperfect abilities more than their fully realized endgame version? It all comes down to one thing: flaw.
It is very true. And I do where this video is taking us. Naturally, this is normally when, as he said, the characters have got a grasp of what their true strength is, but it's at the refined point where it's either doing them damage, it's uncontrollable, or it's unsustainable for whatever reason. And part of the beauty about this stage in their development is that they've come far to the point of learning ability, which was part of the first hurdle. Now it's where they come at an additional level of mastery, of truly understanding their abilities and learn to use it in its most optimal way. It's really in tangent with the idea of, in order to master this ability, they have to first understand themselves as well, which adds the level of growth. So you have two elements where the growth is combined of the ability as well as the character's journey and him becoming more of a complete person. And these two being intertwined is what makes it very interesting. Naturally, he hasn't spoke about this yet in this video, but I'm guessing this is what he's going to lean into. But stick around to see if I'm correct.
When ability, there's a trifecta of flaws that a writer should consider. Each element adds depth, and together, they shape how the ability interacts with the story. The first of these is the weakness, and is actually the least important of the three. Weaknesses are what counter the ability. It's useful to have a few in mind when crafting powers. Go for hard counters, like an ability that becomes completely useless in the light, while others opt for a more indirect weakness, like situational disadvantages. But overall, this is the most superficial layer. The next trifecta is the limitations of the ability. These refer to the upper bounds of what the ability can actually achieve, the limits of its destructive power, the maximum output the user can reach, or the points where the character can't push it further. It defines the ceiling of their potential, at least for now. And then there's the drawback, which I believe is the most
How
interesting
parts?
piece of this trifecta. Drawbacks are consequences that directly punish the user for misusing or
The
overusing
price
their
power.
Think of a character who burns themselves by pushing their fire abilities too far, or someone who suffers painful recoil from pushing their body beyond its limits. These drawbacks ground the power in risk and consequence, and that makes them fascinating. And therein lies the main issue with polished endgame abilities. Writers often completely erase this entire trifecta. As characters grow stronger,
part of
abilities
the-
tend to lose their limitations. What once had a strict boundary now feels limitless. Counters become irrelevant because the power is so versatile it can adapt to anything. And worst of all, the drawbacks, the essential elements of tension, are dropped altogether. And why is this a problem?
Before he even states why it's a problem, I inherently don't think that is a problem. As inherently, what part of the shonen journey, the hero's journey, is that you should be able to find your weak, you hit a wall where that's your limit. And then part of your next journey is overcoming the hurdles, overcoming the step backs, overcoming the limits. and surpassing those limits. With surpassing limits, the most common anime tropes of all times, whether it's Dragon Ball Z with Super Saiyan going beyond, whether it's Black Clover with Yami surpassing your limits, all the fairy tales power ups, inherently is a self speaks about the journey of individuality and being able to grow. That's inherently what shonen's about, the growth aspect. I always wants to teach the message of you should always push beyond what you're capable of, but most of the time it is just a mental thing and you're capable of much more. And that's just reflected in its ability in the way they show power. So I don't think it's inherently a flaw. That's just the nature of what shonen action series are all about. But I'd love to hear his thoughts, so let's continue.
Because you lose tension, you lose the sense of risk, of vulnerability, of
Not
creative
necessarily
problem solving.
because everyone's
Flawed
getting
abilities act
stronger.
like puzzles. The protagonist has to think, adapt, and sometimes even suffer to make them work. That struggle adds a layer of complexity to the writing, and when it's gone, something vital is lost. And no parts of storytelling makes this more obvious than with transformations. Only blah 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 percent, whatever. Okay, let's make a deal. If this
I have to inherently disagree with that last point because it doesn't make anything less interesting. Because if anything, it actually makes it more interesting because of the versatility. Now that it's more interesting to see how exactly they're going to use their powers in more complex ways, or which they never thought was possible, in order to defeat the enemy. And also in tangent, it's a case that the enemies are also getting stronger, so they do require more strength. So it's not that the fights are getting easier; they're just now reaching the standard of the upper tiers, who also themselves have no restrictions and no limitations. So if anything, it all balances out.
number goes up to 4% by my next video, I will not make one of these subscriber breaks for the next 3. Okay? Deal. Back to the video. To be honest, I've never really loved transformations as abilities. Most of the time, instead of offering
I
some
love them.
unique new power or a
It wouldn't
creative
be
twist,
shown in
they
anime
usually
without
serve as a
transformation.
glorified stat boost. The character moves faster, the character hits harder, the character tanks more damage, and that's
I'm gonna
it.
let him cook.
Just look at Ichigo's perfected Hollow Mask as one example. It's just a flat boost to his physical abilities. Sure, his attacks are black now or whatever, whoa, cool, but there's nothing really interesting going on besides him being stronger. Now compare these complete transformations to the ones displayed earlier on in the series, and it becomes clear how much more compelling these early transformations were. One aspect that makes these early transformations so much better is the introduction of the berserk state, where the character can only tap into their power while enraged or under extreme stress, losing control of themselves while doing so. And I have to say, I absolutely love these. Just take a
They
look at
can't.
Naruto's version 2 cloak. He can only
The thing
access
is, I like that the berserk state is very good. It's very fascinating to watch. But naturally, this is shown anime. Transformations will always be part of it. And part of transformations is showing the growth between using it and mastering it. And part of them being able to use it properly is the internal battle that they have to have with themselves. Kurama he's going to use now. This berserk state is overcome by him bonding with Kurama. Same for the aesthetic. He becomes he able to overcome and understand himself more, and then he's able to control it better as well. This berserk state as a middle step in them, also not only their strength journey but also their character journey. So on that basis, it is still it's great, but it's just part of the steps of the character's journey, and it is needed. And part of the journey is overcoming that step and getting stronger. So I don't think there's anything wrong with it. I agree that it's hype and amazing, but it's also destructive and chaotic. And part of their journey is learning to control themselves, controlling that power and making it their own, which is part of the fascination and beauty of seeing them overcome it. But maybe I'm wrong though. Let me guys know if you think. Do you prefer the completed states of the powers or the berserk states?
form when emotionally overwhelmed, but the power increase is insane. It's destructive, raw, and comes with serious consequences. Unlike the perfected chakra cloak, which has almost no drawbacks, version 2 carries a real sense of urgency. The red cloak is literally formed by his blood boiling, cutting down his lifespan and destroying his cells. So even though we know Naruto gains the power to turn the tide of battle, we're still stressed watching it, wondering how he'll manage the aftermath. Or take Ichigo's earlier version of the Hollow Mask. Zangetsu would only step in when Ichigo was desperate, and even then, there was a constant threat of his inner hollow taking control. Every single time Ichigo was forced to use this form, it represented a failure of his ideals, having to borrow strength from the more primal version of himself, introducing an internal and deeper power struggle. These forms are so great because they introduce a second layer of tension. It's no longer just about winning the fight, it's also about managing the transformation itself. The protagonist is walking a tightrope, balancing risk with power and control. The limitation is that they can only access the form under extreme stress, and the drawback is that when they do, no one around them, not even themselves, is truly safe. But if you want an example of an early series transformation without the inner struggle dynamic, look no further than Kaio-Ken. If you were to ask me what my favorite Dragon Ball transformation was, I'd have to go with the most iconic choice and say Super Saiyan. But don't get it twisted, Kaio-Ken is right there behind it. Kaio-Ken is a simple yet effective transformation that perfectly balances risk and reward, allowing the users to tap into increasingly higher multiplications of power at the cost of damaging their body. What I especially love about this transformation is how variable and dynamic it is. Goku can decide how far to push it moment to moment, sometimes dipping into higher multipliers extremely briefly to minimize damage, while generally maintaining a safer range. That element of choice and strategy is what makes it way more engaging than basic transformations that just hand out stat boosts with no real consequences. Now for the real reason I made this video, to rant about how One For All was more interesting in the first 2 seasons than in the entire rest of the show. I'm just kidding. Super strength is one of the most overused powers in all of fiction. Superman, Spider-Man, at this point, literally every shonen power system has it bundled in like it's part of a starter kit. But the early version of One For All, that was one of the most unique takes on super strength I had ever seen, and that's all because of its ridiculous drawback. Hirokoshi nailed the raw impact of the ability by making it physically destructive, not just to the environment, but to the user themselves. When Deku used One For All early on, his limbs leaped, and it's not just that. The wind howled and the air physically bent with every single punch. We as the audience didn't need to be told that One For All was strong. We could see it for ourselves. Remember when All Might literally changed the weather with a single punch? That's how you sell power. But what really sold One For All as special to me was the toll it took, the drawback. Seeing Deku burn through his own limbs like they're bullets in a chamber, shattering fingers, breaking arms, using already broken limbs to keep fighting, it's one of the sickest dynamics I've seen come out of a power system. Sure, he inevitably had to evolve past this level of self-destruction. But for me, that broken version of One For All, the version that majorly cost him something, is more interesting than any of the 6 quirks they later slapped onto him. And one of my favorite tropes to come out of this is when a character manages to use their abilities' drawbacks to their advantage. You don't get to see those kinds of scenarios.
Just to speak on Deku real quick, early My Hero Academia, it does really depict it very well. I've started this video by speaking about the cost of power, or the price of power, and that is very true. But as all hero's journey is, it's about finding that price, then them understanding the true weight behind that power, making them be able to better appreciate that power and be able to use it in a more viable way, and that's part of their journey. To say that it was better when it was weaker is a contradiction of itself, because when they complete the power is done, it is a lot more interesting because now they're not held back by that weakness. They can now truly explore it for what it is. Like punching fists can affect the whole climate. If Deku was still at the point where he's always breaking and he couldn't do that, we would never be able to see that happen. As one of the simplest examples, every time they surpass a limit, that only adds greater ways of the character to grow, more different paths they can use it, and actually remove the restrictions. It's almost like he's saying having restrictions make it more interesting. But I would say the opposite is actually true. Having no restrictions is more interesting because the diversity and the exploration of how far the ability can go in all different directions becomes open. But that's just my personal opinion.
With perfect abilities. Like with solo leveling, every single time an opponent tries to poison Jinwoo, nothing fucking happens because he's completely immune and his ability has no drawbacks nor limitations. I just roll my eyes because of how boring that is. Now compare that to liberally breaking his own fingers with One For All to break out of Shinso's brainwashing, and you can instantly tell which of these 2 scenarios is more interesting to me. But in my opinion, one puts their flawed ability to the use better than Yuji Itadori. For most of Jujutsu Kaisen, Yuji is technically powerless. Compared to other sorcerers, he doesn't have a flashy curse technique. What he does have is inhuman super strength and dysfunctional cursed energy control, which again sounds basic, but luckily, Gege knew how to take a flaw and turn it into a feature. Enter Divergent. At first glance, it's not even a real technique. Rather, it's an unfortunate side effect of Yuji being unable to sync his cursed energy with his punches properly. But because of this flaw, Yuji's attacks gain a delayed second impact. It's much weaker than a perfectly timed curse-infused punch, but if used properly, it does manage to catch opponents off, and that trade-off is what makes it interesting. Yuji is forced to fight with this handicap, but he does manage to use it to his advantage. Again and again, Divergent Fist is capable of messing with opponents' timing and opening up opportunities. And even after Yuji learns how to properly infuse his strikes, he still falls back on it when the timing is right, because even a flawed tool can be turned into a deadly weapon if used properly. So what is the point I'm trying to make? It's simple. Flawed abilities are interesting because they force creativity. They demand a certain kind of growth, not just in raw power, but in how a character thinks. And that struggle, that tension, that give and take, that's where some of the most compelling storytelling happens. When abilities are too clean, too perfect, too convenient, they stop being tools for character development and just become bait for flashy animation sequences or Sakuga compilations. But when they're unpredictable, risky, or dangerous to the user, that's when characters rise above their limits, not just by overpowering the enemy, but also by outsmarting their own flaws. So yeah, no one is denying the fact that endgame power-ups are cool. Everyone loves seeing a protagonist at their peak, but I'll always have a soft spot for that messy middle stage, where the protagonist is still figuring it out, where every fight feels like a gamble, and when victory really and truly means something. Because it's those moments of hopeful desperation that make a story compelling in the first place. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this breakdown, let me know what your favorite.
Quite a good video, I won't lie. There's parts where I agree with, parts I disagree with. And if he's going to take the stand that he has a soft spot for them, it's good. That's fair enough. But if you were to say it's the best part or the best part of the story, no. I have to just straight up disagree. Every part of it, the character's journey, is all leading up to that moment. To say it's not like you actually want him to stay in that middle state forever. That would literally just break the whole journey to begin with. There needs to be growth. There needs to be progression. Otherwise, it'll just be a constant nonsense. And we're saying, why hasn't he got past this yet? Even someone like Megumi, the potential characters, as we love to, as what's been going on recently. We love these potential characters up until the point where they actually are not fulfilling their potential. It'll be the same thing here. We want these characters, we appreciate their difficulties, but we still want them to get to that next step. And that's just all part of the shonen story. But I do love the flaw parts are good, but I don't think anybody would ever like any character who literally stays the exact same strength, flaws from start to end. That's not what we want to watch. We want to see growth, overcoming, and peak state. But that was just my take. I'd love to hear your thoughts down below in the comments. Like, comment, and subscribe. Let me know what kind of videos you'd like me to react to and give my breakdowns and personal opinions too. But that was me. Till next time, ciao.